Sharp Loss of Weight by Norman P. Kaufman. They gave me 20 years, so I behaved myself. Did only 13. Only 13. Come to sunny Wormwood Scrubs, bridge the gap between innocent teens and soured, embittered early 30s. Excuse the twisted attempt at humour. The Scrubs is hardly the ideal spot for developing one's talent for light banter. I was known as the model prisoner during my stay. If ever I'd felt like laughing at anything during those long and sickening years, then this at least was worth a chuckle. Model indeed. Oh yes, I was quiet enough. No sit-down strikes, no swearing, no riots, no nothing. That was me. Maybe I'd thought of livening things up a little, right at the beginning. But the Scrubs can gouge the fibre from the proudest of backbones. And there was something else on my mind that may have added to my apparent air of couldn't care less. Something apart from the company of thieves, rapists, murderers and the like. Or the nerve-stretching clang of the cell doors at 9 each night. Or the pervading, all-enveloping, putrid stench of unwashed bodies. The stink of the whole rotten place that eats its way into the skin, so that the reek of it is with you forevermore. But yes, there were other things on my mind, like what I would do when I got out, and where I would go, and whom I would see. Especially Mory. The idea of one day meeting up again with Mory occupied a very special niche in my waking dreams. I could recall his great bloated, drink-raddled face easily enough, and the convex mound of flesh that strained at his waistband, and the snorting breath that wheezed wetly from those sausage lips of his. But I had never seen the ingrained sneer on his pock-marked features turn into a grimace of sheer unsullied fright. I had never been privileged to witness runnels of sweat coursing down his cheeks as he begged me not to shoot. For that was my avowed intention. That was the notion I clung to throughout the endless years, the ambition that helped me retain the remnants of my sanity. Very likely they would put me back in again if I were caught, but then it would be for a crime I actually had committed, and not for one which Mory had set me up. Extenuating circumstances, the learned judge had told me. You're so young, he had continued, or I might well have had you detained for the rest of your natural life. That pompous old fool, what could he know? Doubtless his youth had been spent in some other environment than the dungeons of Wormwood Scrubs, but now I was out, and the first, last and only thing that mattered was to arrange for the extermination of a certain Mory. So 13 years to the day since I had stepped across its grim threshold, the Scrubs spewed me out onto the pavement. It didn't occur to me that I was free at last, that I was still young, that the sun was shining. For cold single-mindedness, there was no one to touch me that morning. I had £2 in my pocket, and 30 shillings of that went on a second-hand Luger. Pay your money, and no questions asked, was the shop owner's attitude, and I was thankful for it. The remaining cash bought me a double helping of ham and chips, and a trip across town to where Mory had lived, and would, if all went well, shortly die. I stepped off the bus, aware that my mouth was dry, my heart beating a little faster. It was not unlike the feeling I had experienced 18 years before, when I had met my very first date. I swallowed a smile at the incongruity of the comparison. The joys of youth, the vengeance of a two-time loser. The house was still there, just as I remembered it, as beautiful as Mory had never been. I stared at the long winding drive, the acacia trees that lined it, the mansion-like spread of the building ahead of me. That a man should sink so low and yet have possessions such as these. My grip tightened on the Luger, shoving it deeper into my coat pocket. The woman who answered the bell was quite unlike anyone I had ever seen in Mory's company. For one thing, she was short and dumpy. Wisps of grey stood out from her colourless hair, done up as it was in a nondescript bun. She was well past 50, and made no attempt to conceal the fact. "Is Mory available?" I inquired, and tried a smile on her, but either she was too old for my charm to work on her, or maybe I wasn't as handsome as I liked to believe. Perhaps the scrubs had had something to do with that. "Won't you come in?" she said in a voice that plainly said, "I don't care whether you come in or not." But in I went. I had no reason to be proud any more, and getting in the house as easily as this was the best thing I could have hoped for. This oh-so-plain little woman led me down the gloomiest hallway in the world and stopped at a door at the far end. Whether or not she was intended to knock, I don't know, but without so much as a "by your leave," she twisted the handle and flounced in, letting me stand behind her like a humble schoolboy. If this were part of Mory's softening up process, then things had certainly changed since the old days. Or could it be that he had actually had an attack of respectability? Whatever the case, the answer would be something Mory himself could understand, if not appreciate. I would shoot his face off. She stood just inside the room, which itself was lighted by about a dozen candles that stood along the skirting board to the left-hand wall. Just for a second, I hesitated. There was something odd about this setup, but I hadn't waited all this time just to back out now, and all I could lose was my life. With a kind of mental shrug, I followed her into the room. Mory was there, and I was right, things certainly had changed. Like some gross fly caught in a mechanized web, he hung suspended from great steel chains that were stapled to the ceiling and wall. His clothes hung in shreds from his now emaciated body. The greasy black hair was now white, what was left of it. His limbs were shriveled, fleshless. Only the muted glint in his shadowy eyes showed that he lived. The woman met my gaze of instinctive horror with a calm that itself held a terrible fascination of its own. If she were aware of my slackly open mouth, my dilated eyes, my shallow breathing, she gave no sign. "Shirley was my daughter," she said. Her voice was as empty as her face. I turned away from those sad eyes. "She was 17 when Mory took her away. And you must be the boy who got the blame." I forced myself to meet her stare. "My daughter was violated and strangled," the woman went on. "But Mory lived." She paused. And to me, mister, that seemed unfair. Very, very unfair. She moved towards what was left of fat Mory. "So, I got a job here as housekeeper." At first he wasn't keen on someone of my age and looks, but I managed to persuade him that good cooking and cleaning is a great substitute for the giggling young things he kept here. She waved a work-coarsened hand towards her victim. Naturally, he didn't know who I was, until one morning I knocked him over the head, trussed him up until I could get the proper equipment. She gestured at the chains with a certain pride, as if she were a child with a new toy. "He's been like this for close on 13 years, mister. I feed him now and again, just to keep the spark of life going. No one comes here. I get my own provisions. There was plenty of money in the house for the rest of our lives." For the first time there was a sheen of tears in her washed-out blue eyes. "I came here to kill him." Somehow my voice sounded like that of a stranger. "No, please don't do that." The woman's tone was tense, urgent. She knuckled the tears away savagely. "You lost all those years of your life, I know that, but I lost my daughter." She turned to stare at what had once been Mory. "Don't you understand, mister? He's no more fit to die than he is to live." We stood looking at each other for a moment or two, the dowdy little woman and the ex-convict. Then, without another word, I turned and made my way out of that darkened, dreadful little room, along the corridor, out into the eye-aching sunlight. The rest is history. Ditching the Luger in the nearest waste bin, walking to the nearest employment exchange, and eventually getting fixed up with a fair job. But I still think back to that house, to Mory and what might have been. And in my heart, I'm satisfied that for fat Mory at least, death would be infinitely more preferable than life.
you.